The Last Wish. Lead gray clouds loomed over Redstone Prison as James Harlow was let out of death row. His steps were slow but steady, as if he was not walking toward death, but towards some inevitable yet important moment of his life. The prison chaplain walked beside him, silently clutching his prayer book, but James paid him no attention. He was thinking of only one thing. Soon he would see his dog, Becky. 3 months ago, he ended up here, accused of a crime he did not commit. The trial had been swift, the lawyer indifferent, and the jury had paid no attention to either his words or his tears. The only being who had always believed in him, who had stayed by his side through the darkest times, was his loyal shepherd, Becky. When he was told he could make a last request, he had not hesitated for a second. "I want to see Becky," he said. At first, the guards were surprised. Most people asked for a cigarette, a good meal, or a conversation with their family. But there was something in James's eyes that made the prison warden agree. They led him down a long corridor. The floors creaked under the heavy boots of the guards. Finally, they brought him out into the prison courtyard, surrounded by a high brick wall. There, under the drizzling rain, she stood, Becky, a graying muzzle, a hunched back, eyes full of loyal sorrow. Beside her stood a young man in a simple jacket, a shelter volunteer who had brought her here. When Becky saw James, she gave a sharp cry and lunged forward, pulling on the leash. The volunteer let her go, and the dog rushed full speed into his arms. James dropped to his knees and hugged her, burying his face in her wet fur. He did not notice how everyone around, the guards, the warden, the chaplain, froze, struck by the sheer strength of the bond between the man and the animal. Becky licked his face, whimpered, wagged her tail, as if trying to erase all his suffering with her warmth. James stroked her, whispered something into her ear, words that were their secret alone. And then something strange happened. Becky suddenly tensed, her fur standing on end. She growled, staring at the prison warden. Then she took a few steps to the side, as if placing herself between James and everyone else. A threatening growl rose from her throat, completely unlike her normally gentle nature. Everyone froze. The prison warden frowned and took a step forward to call out to James. At that moment, Becky barked, but not just any bark. It was as if she was giving a signal. The volunteer who had brought the dog suddenly said loudly, "She can sense lies. I work with detector dogs, and this dog has been trained to sense fear and lies in people." Everyone looked at the warden. His face turned pale. He took another step back. "What are you trying to say?" one of the guards asked roughly. The volunteer took a few steps forward, continuing to speak calmly. "I worked with the police. Dogs like this are trained to detect not only drugs, but also people who are hiding something important. Usually they react this way when someone nearby is involved in a crime or in deceit." At that moment, Becky growled again, standing in front of James like a living wall. The warden tried to pull himself together, but sweat broke out on his forehead. "This is nonsense," he shouted. "Get that dog out of here." But it was too late. One of the younger guards, lowering his voice, whispered to his superior, "Maybe we should check. This is all just too strange." Half an hour later, an inspection began, initiated by a district representative who had suddenly arrived. It turned out that the evidence against James had been falsified. The prison warden had taken a bribe to stay silent and to expedite the execution. Shock and horror swept through Redstone as the truth came to light. James was freed. He stood at the prison gates, hugging Becky, breathing free air for the first time in many months. He did not know what awaited him next. But one thing was clear. He had been saved by his loyal dog, his only true friend. And Becky, tired but happy, sat beside him and laid her head on his knees as if saying, "Now everything will be all right." Soon after his release, James found himself on the margins of life. He had no home, no job, no family to return to. His name now appeared in the news, but not everyone believed in his innocence. Some thought he was just a lucky man who had managed to slip away. But James did not complain. Everything he needed he held in his hands. An old leather leash, with Becky briskly walking at the other end. They spent their first nights at a small homeless shelter. People eyed the man with the dog warily, but Becky seemed to sense the mood around her and behaved perfectly, sitting quietly at his feet, never taking her eyes off her master. After a few days, fortune finally smiled on him. The volunteer who had brought Becky to the prison turned out not to be just a shelter worker, but a former police dog handler. His name was Adam Reeves, and he offered James a job, helping to train dogs. "They need you," Adam said one evening, watching James train a group of puppies. "And Becky needs you. You gave both of you a second chance. Now give one to yourself." Thus began a new chapter in his life. James threw himself into his work. He learned to read the language of dogs, to understand their fears, desires, weaknesses, and strengths. Becky became his constant assistant, especially when working with difficult animals. She seemed to know which dog needed simply to have someone lie quietly beside them, and which needed a gentle push toward trust. Rumors about the man saved by a dog began to spread throughout the county. One day, a woman came to the training ground with a teenager. The boy kept his distance, his hands trembling. It turned out he had survived an attack and now was even afraid to meet a dog's gaze. James did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply brought Becky over. The old shepherd calmly approached, lay down on the ground, and stretched out her paw. The boy stared at her for a long time, and then slowly, almost unconsciously, reached out his hand. At that moment, James realized Becky had not only saved him, she was saving others too. Months passed. James managed to save up some money. He rented a small house on the edge of town, with a large yard and a creaky wooden porch. The first thing he did was build a spacious kennel and start fostering homeless dogs. One evening, sitting on the porch with a cup of hot coffee, he looked at Becky. She was lying nearby, her muzzle resting against his leg. "We're doing pretty well, aren't we, old girl?" he said. Becky opened one eye and lazily wagged her tail. But happiness never comes without trials. One autumn morning, Becky fell ill. She barely managed to stand, refused food, and breathed heavily. In a panic, James rushed her to the veterinarian. The wait for the diagnosis felt like an eternity. The doctor carefully removed his glasses, looked at James, and quietly said, "She's old, James. Very old. Her heart is failing. She doesn't have much time left." The blows of those words were heavier than any court sentence. "Is there anything we can do?" James managed to ask. "Just be with her, until the very end." And James was there. He did not leave Becky's side for a moment. They watched the sunrises together, sat by the fireplace in the evenings, and walked the familiar paths, though now Becky's steps were slow and unsteady. On her last night, she lay down by his bed, as she always did. James sat down beside her, rested his head on her fur, and closed his eyes. When he woke up, the room was already flooded with warm sunlight. Becky lay peacefully, her chest no longer rising. He did not cry. He just sat silently looking at her. As he had once sat in death row, only now there were no bars and no anger. There was only love. He buried Becky in the garden, under the big oak tree. He placed a wooden sign above her grave. Becky, the one who believed. And though James's heart was broken, he knew. She had left him not just memories. She had left him a mission to save others. And he continued, for her, for all those still waiting for their second chance.